We're now into 2025, so it's time to take an unbiased and data-driven outlook on how the next year could look for BTC. Today we're going to be doing a 2025 outlook for BTC, and where better to start than the MVRV score we have here on BitcoinMagazinePro.com. So firstly, I'd like to start off this 2025 outlook video by saying we almost certainly haven't topped for this cycle. What we can see is by pretty much all on-chain metrics, we still have plenty of upside room to go. And pretty much every macroeconomic condition, which could look even better than it has throughout 2024, which didn't look great, we'll cover that later, is setting the stage for a considerably more bullish 2025. So first and foremost, the MVRV score. This is looking at the ratio between the realized price or realized cap, which is the average accumulation price of all BTC on the network, and the market cap of BTC. And what we can see is the raw MVRV data here, or if we convert it to a Z score, which is essentially just standardizing the data for its volatility, what we can see is we still have considerably more room to go for the upside. I wouldn't necessarily say that I'll be desperately waiting for Bitcoin to reach this upper regions of values of 7+ on this score. To be honest, once we start getting to 6 or above, around that quite overextended territory, I'll definitely be looking for other metrics for confluence to maybe see that we're getting towards a Bitcoin peak. But ultimately, regardless of that, we're still looking incredibly healthy. We've still got plenty of upside room to go. We're at comparable levels to where Bitcoin was in May 2017 when the price was just a few $1,000s, and compared to where Bitcoin peaked at $20,000, we still have potentially multiple hundreds of percent gains still to go. And alongside that, we're still seeing considerably bullish conditions. Even though we've had a little bit of a more bearish few weeks, we can't get crowded out by short-term pullbacks. I know we've had a all-time high at around $108,000 before we dipped to the low $90,000 region, but really things still look good. If you just zoom out, this chart looks exceptionally good. This is the pi cycle top and bottom, or as I like to call it, the pi cycle oscillator. This is looking at two moving averages, the 111-day and the 350-day moving average multiplied by a value of 2. And historically, once these moving averages have crossed over, it's marked the timing of a Bitcoin price action peak within just a few days. What we can do is just measure essentially the distance between these two moving averages to kind of see the trend that we can maybe expect over the coming weeks and months. And as we can see, this has recently begun trending once again to the upside, potentially signifying much more bullish conditions over the coming weeks and months for BTC, especially after we had multiple months in 2024 of pretty boring, choppy, sideways consolidation price action. So that's looking incredibly positive as well. And what we can see is Bitcoin, even though we did have a great 2024 with over 100% gains, we can see that we really haven't begun to enter the exponential phase of Bitcoin price action. If I just add on the tool here so we can draw on the chart, if I just come down here, what we can see is Bitcoin usually has these periods where its year-on-year gains are pretty good, obviously pretty strong, over 100% gains. But once we really surpass this red line that I've just drawn on here, we enter the exponential phase of a cycle. So we can see we've just been hovering around this line here, and there likely will be some degree of diminishing returns. We're probably not going to reach 1,500% year-on-year gains this cycle. But what we can see is after we've had this post-halving cool-off period that lasts anywhere from 6 to 12 months or so, like we've seen, once we actually break above this is when things really start getting crazy. We really start seeing FOMO. We really start seeing retail flood back into the markets. And this cycle, we're not just going to be relying on retail capital coming in. We're going to be seeing institutional players, sovereign states potentially, all rushing in with FOMO to buy BTC. And just because you believe that these large, sophisticated investors, because they have larger amounts of capital, they're not going to be as susceptible to FOMO or anything, that's completely wrong. As soon as Bitcoin starts reaching new all-time highs again, we're going to start seeing these 10,000 daily candles, and we are going to see Bitcoin accumulated by these institutions due to FOMO. If I just go to the Bitcoin price action chart here, what I've done is lined up the halving events that we've seen every 4 years or so and the previous all-time highs that we saw. So what we can see, if I just get this tool here, is if we go to 2016, for example, what we saw is at the Bitcoin halving event, it was around 9 months before Bitcoin actually closed above the previous all-time high it set a few years earlier. In the next cycle, it was a similar story from the Bitcoin halving event till we closed above that. It was 8 months. And what we can see is in our current cycle, I know we did slightly surpass the previous all-time high, but we'll assume that that wasn't quite the case. And what we can see is, again, it was 7 months until we closed convincingly above that previous all-time high. So we're pretty much on schedule with where we would expect to be when looking at comparisons to previous cycles. But what we can then do is look at the amount of time it actually took from surpassing that previous all-time high to actually hitting a price cycle peak. So what we can do is just grab here, and it was 8 months from closing above that previous all-time high for a price peak. Then in this one, the next cycle, it was 11 months. So potentially we have between 8 and 11 months from that close above the previous all-time high before we start topping out. What we can do is just grab there and say 8 to 11 months from that point will give us somewhere between July 2025 and October 2025. So we're likely going to see a vast majority of 2025 with incredibly bullish price action. And this is the exponential phase of price action where a vast majority of the gains are made. Of course, we are seeing diminishing returns, but even in the previous cycle, from the point of breaking our previous all-time high at around $20,000, we then topped out at near $70,000. And in the cycle before that, when the all-time high was around $1,200, we topped out at near $20,000. So even if we just see a 2x on the previous cycle where we topped out around $70,000, $140,000 Bitcoin would be great. A 3x, $210,000. All of these are realistic potential scenarios for BTC, especially considering the supply and demand economics of Bitcoin and the stage that is being set for incredibly bullish macro factors for Bitcoin in 2025. If we just look at Bitcoin versus the US dollar strength index, or the DXY here, we can see through large phases of 2024, this was actually rallying considerably to the upside. And considering we usually have a inverse correlation between the Bitcoin price appreciation and the US dollar strength increasing, essentially these two move in opposite directions. The fact that Bitcoin has rallied so strongly in face of rising US dollar strength gives us some great indication that once this does start turning over and we see the US dollar strength begin decreasing once again, that Bitcoin's upside potential is absolutely massive. So that's one incredibly bullish factor. We can also look at something like the high yield credit cycles, which is again influenced by the US dollar strength and just the US economy in general. We can see that while this has been increasing throughout 2024, it has actually been on the decline for the past few months, indicating that there's not as much of a greedy risk on sentiment in traditional markets. And given the presidential election results we saw in 2024 and the following year we're probably going to see of much more favorable economic conditions, it would not surprise me to see this begin rallying again to the upside like we have seen in all previous cycles. Once this begins topping out, that's usually when we see a Bitcoin price peak, and we're not even close to seeing this metric topping out. And again, this is going to be influenced very heavily by the global M2 money supply, which once again has been actually showing a bit of a contraction in the money supply over the past few months. Even as Bitcoin has rallied substantially, we've seen this begin decreasing in terms of its year-on-year percentage gains. And as pretty much every single chart shows, not just macroeconomic, not just on-chain, not just technical factors, all of these have considerably more room to go to the upside. If this cycle is anything like the previous cycles, which again, we're not seeing any indication that that isn't going to be the case, we're likely going to see this global M2 begin topping out way up in these regions of 15 to 20%, whereas right now we're only at about 4.5% on this year-on-year increase or expansion in the global M2 money supply. So this is another chart I'm going to be watching with all indications that this is going to begin increasing again throughout 2025. And this is all alongside the fact that we're also seeing rumors of a US Bitcoin strategic reserve beginning to come into effect, where the US economy, the US government wants to accumulate 1 million Bitcoin. We've gone from an asset created by an anonymous user 16 years ago to now the US government wanting to buy 1 million of this very limited supply currency, which is absolutely insane, absurd to think about. And alongside the ETF accumulation we've seen, the MicroStrategy and sovereign state accumulation, we're seeing such a surge in demand for Bitcoin that it's absolutely unfathomable to imagine the potentials for the next few years, especially just considering the supply and demand economics of BTC. We have over 94% of Bitcoin that will ever exist are currently in circulation, and a few million of those are Satoshi coins or lost coins. And then you take into account that there's going to be millions bought by these institutions that are likely not going to sell for years or decades. There's just so few Bitcoin available for people to actually accumulate themselves. If we look at the long and short-term holders supply chart we have here, we can see throughout 2024 we did see this long-term holder supply dip from around 16.3 million coins, we'll say, temporarily down to around 14.7, 14.8 as we reached our first all-time high in March, but then it rallied again and we're now dipped to around 14.5, 14.6 million. But again, this probably, looking at previous cycles, have another 500,000 to a million Bitcoin left to be accumulated or transferred from long-term holders to short-term holders. But this cycle could actually break a lot of these metrics for all the reasons we discussed previously. The illiquidity of Bitcoin is currently unlike anything we've ever seen. And unlike previous cycles, which were mainly retail driven, which saw a huge amount of coins accumulated by short-term holders as long-term holders were looking to offload a huge amount of their BTC, this cycle we might not see as many coins being sold because the opportunity cost is just simply too high. If we look at something like the cycle capital flows chart we have here, what we can see is, regardless of this, we are still expecting to see a bit of a retail or institutional surge of capitals as new market participants enter the space. We're still well away from where we'd usually consider this metric to be topping out, the amount of new capital to be coming in. What we can see is in 2017, this metric topped out around 65%, then in 2021 around 55%, and currently we're around 35%. So we still have a huge amount of BTC to be accumulated by new participants before we really consider us to be at overheated conditions. And another way to view this is, rather than new capital coming in, we can actually track the value of older and more experienced coins transferring hands by looking at something like the value days destroyed chart. What we can see is, again, this is looking incredibly healthy. Of course, we had this huge peak earlier in 2024 when Bitcoin first set a new all-time high at around $73,000. But since then, we've been cooling off and now at comparable levels to somewhere in early 2017, where Bitcoin was just a few $1,000s before, again, Bitcoin topped out at $20,000, or at similar levels to Bitcoin in the 2020 cycle, where price was about $14,000, $15,000 before we topped out at $70,000. There is still such a huge amount of upside potential to go. And if we look at something like the Bitcoin cycle master chart, where Bitcoin has always reached this upper valuation, this is looking at a combination of multiple on-chain valuation metrics to try and figure where Bitcoin could top out. And what we can see is, historically, it has been incredibly accurate. And looking at the red overvalued line, which currently sits at around $189,000, but continuing to increase, Bitcoin still has so much more room to grow. We're not even at the aggressively valued line on this chart yet. We've not even reached it, even as Bitcoin reached $108,000. So really, throughout 2025, we have every reason to be even more bullish than we have been over the previous few months, and every indication that this could be one of the Bitcoin's best years ever. Also, if you haven't already, please don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to ensure you're receiving all of our content as soon as it's released. And make sure to check out all the resources we've discussed today, as well as the many more that are all available on BitcoinMagazinePro.com, your number one source for Bitcoin analysis. So just to summarize, 2025 looks to be another promising year for Bitcoin as we enter what will likely be the exponential phase of Bitcoin price appreciation, especially if we're to follow the similar 4-year cycle patterns that we've seen for BTC over the previous few cycles. We'll probably have 8 to 11 months of incredibly bullish and positive price action for BTC before we top out somewhere potentially in summer or Q4 of 2025. And even though we've had a few weeks of potentially not great price action as Bitcoin has retraced slightly from its all-time high, these short-term data points really can be ignored when we're looking at a macro perspective. We're always going to get 10, 20, potentially even 30% drawdowns throughout a Bitcoin bull cycle. And even though things can look overbought slightly on a short-term basis, once we zoom out, look at more macro perspective, on-chain data points, macroeconomic data points, market cycle, etc., everything looks incredibly bullish for BTC and definitely does not indicate that we've already topped for this cycle. And really, it's a testament to the strength of BTC that we are where we are, considering that macroeconomic conditions have been less than favorable for a majority of 2024. Really, the stage is set for the most favorable changes we've ever seen, looking at the US economy and the new president and the strategic reserve, global M2 money expansion. By pretty much all accounts, BTC for 2025 looks like we could have one of the best years in Bitcoin's history. Although I will say, throughout all of this, when the alarm bells do start ringing, once we do start seeing the value days destroyed really topping out, the long-term holder supply massively decreasing, reaching the overvalued levels on the cycle master, pay attention. Ignoring everything else, Bitcoin's price is determined by supply and demand economics. If we're seeing a huge amount of BTC flooding the market from long-term holders, that is increasing the supply. If we're seeing less capital inflows, that potentially indicates a reduced demand. Don't necessarily get carried away with a super cycle, and this time could be different. Of course, that could be the case, but this is why we don't sell 100% as soon as we get the first sell signal. We just need to start scaling out sensibly. But every cycle, there has been the narrative of this time's going to be different, this is going to be the super cycle, etc. Once everything starts flashing that we may be overheated, don't ignore that. Don't think that this time is definitely different. Really manage your risk, rotate out, take profits, lock it in. Please don't round trip into the next cycle. Of course, 2025 could be one of the best years we've ever had for BTC, and I certainly hope it will be. But looking at the data, we can't ignore that. Once everything starts flashing, don't be bag holding into the next cycle. If you liked this video, then please visit bitcoinmagazinepro.com, where our analytics help you to cut through the noise to make informed, data-driven decisions about Bitcoin. With over 150 live charts, personalized indicator alerts, in-depth crypto industry reports, API access, and more, all for a fraction of the standard industry price. And at the minute, we do have a New Year deal offering 30% off for site subscriptions. So if you're not already, definitely lock in one of the best prices you'll get for the next potentially year or so. 30% off is really an amazing deal, considering we're already probably the cheapest on-chain data platform providing all of these amazing features. And let me know what your thoughts are on Bitcoin throughout 2025. Do you think we're going to have a great year, or do you maybe think maybe we have topped out and we're not going to be as bullish as maybe everyone's anticipating? Let me know in the comments below and on social media. I look forward to reading and replying to them. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.